Greetings! Welcome to the Cyber Diner podcast presented by Cal Poly California Cybersecurity Institute. My name is Ryan Vanucci, and I'll be hosting this show every couple of weeks from right here in our San Luis Obispo studio. This is the very first episode of the show, and I want to personally thank you for stopping by the diner for a quick bite. Our goal for the Cyber Diner is to connect people who are interested in entering cybersecurity or other tech-related career fields directly to some of the conversations happening on the front lines of industry, so that you can stay relevant in such a fast-paced and evolving digital world. And we want to have fun doing it. Tech-related careers are sometimes portrayed as intimidating and hyper-specialized. And while you definitely need to know your stuff, it doesn't have to be difficult to start exploring what's out there. So, each week we're going to be hanging out with a special guest from industry, academia, or government. And I'll be asking them about what they do, why they do it, and how you can do it too. I'll be learning right alongside you as we listen to some of the best demystify modern cyber problems over a cup of coffee. So to start things off, we're going to spend a couple of episodes diving into the space industry. As innovators take to the skies with more and more satellites and other tech, the way we think about securing data in space is changing. Remotely joining us at the diner today is Eric Escobar, a professional penetration tester and Cal Poly engineering graduate. Eric consults as a penetration tester at cybersecurity company SecureWorks. He spends most of his time hacking into all types of major systems and reporting the vulnerabilities that he finds along the way. Eric has successfully compromised systems in almost every sector you can think of. In fact, he's so good at his craft that he's been banned from competing in the wireless capture the flag event at DEFCON, which is the biggest hacking conference in the world, because he won the competition 3 years in a row. Now that's good for a free milkshake on the house. Eric and I are going to be talking about his journey into the world of ethical hacking and his day-to-day role as a pen tester. I'm also going to ask him about security challenges in the rapidly growing space industry. Well, that means it's time to get to it. Thanks again for stopping by, and enjoy the interview. All right, hey, what's going on, Eric?
Yo, what's shaking? Oh, look at you, fancy studio.
I know, yeah, we dressed it up pretty good, huh? We've got, we even had one of our graphic designers do some really cool artwork in the theme of the show.
Wow, makes my garbage look terrible.
Well, you know, I mean, it's not necessarily our goal, but my assumption is that whenever we do Zoom calls, we're gonna be taking taking the trophy home when it comes to set design. But I even found some condiment stuff.
Yeah, I saw that
to tie in the diner theme. Yeah, this was in the kids section at Target. They have
that doesn't surprise me one bit. With a little fake dangly.
Yeah, it's great. You don't happen to have a diner set for your kids, do you? Do you get the?
Oh, I do. I have
one of those kitchen
diner
sets.
Set. We have the all salt and pepper shaker. We have you name it.
Well, now I am a little disappointed then with your background because you could have tied in some details.
It would have been a lot of Anna, a lot of Elsa, a lot of Frozen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it would have been a lot of that.
That would be. A lot different maybe than what we've got going on here, but no big deal.
Maybe not though.
The Cyber Diner, it could blow up. It really could. If we maybe have our own kids diner set someday, we'll your kids might be grown up by then though, so we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, welcome back. This is the third time that you and I have talked. And but this is the first time I think we've talked on officially over camera, face to face. Yeah. Because I can't remember if I've met you in person or not. I don't think that there's ever been
It would have been at some point when I was probably doing some other Cal Poly stuff, or maybe if you were at DEFCON. If you were at DEFCON, I would have definitely met you with a big group of Cal Poly people.
I went to DEFCON when it was a small group of Cal Poly people, so I'm not sure if we met there, but it was me and one. It was 2018 DEFCON. That was the one I was present at.
I was definitely there. I probably did not meet you at that DEFCON.
Okay. Yeah, we were with Bug Crowd was who we were kind of there working with and helping out. So that was, it was really cool. I'd never been to such a conference before. It was a very different experience.
When it was, what was 2018?
I want to say it was at Caesar's Palace.
Yeah, Caesar's Palace. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, talk about 30,000 people, all of which, maybe 10% haven't showered in a number of days. It's an interesting smell.
Yeah, well, it's so different nowadays when everybody's just at home, and DEFCON was online this year. We worked together even a little bit preparing. I helped you kind of get your presentation set up.
Aerospace village stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a fun time.
Yeah.
I even got the badge for that. The tape. That was cool for me to go through and put the tape. I have a little tape player in my car. I don't have one like in my house, but checking out all the original sounds and also the puzzles in there. That was pretty different.
Yeah, no, it's I know they always come up with a lot of stuff that's like, I feel like it's one of those things you have, they give you 3 weeks worth of content and material to like go through that you'll never get through at all of DEF CON. So it's always interesting seeing what stuff they come up with.
Okay, so why don't we start with your backstory at Cal Poly? Can you just kind of start with, where you started? I know it was as not a computer science major or a software major, and then also talk a little bit about how that led you to penetration testing and what you do now.
Gosh, I went to Cal Poly with hopes of being a civil engineer to get a majoring in civil engineering. I lived in Yosemite was my freshman dorm, and then I went from there into Poly Canyon. So that was a lot of the fun times, meeting everybody in the dorms and having all that. And that's kind of where I started all of my, my fun hacking times, where I started learning that with my roommate. And so I went all through Cal Poly, got my degree in civil engineering, definitely used all of my computer expertise as, just in all my CAD classes, all of my engineering classes. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I was not at all computer science, software engineering by any shape of the imagination. And really basically what happened is I started working civil engineering job, always interested in software and, doing some light development. And my college roommate happened to be in town. His parents live where I lived. And so he happened to be in town. So we were over at his parents' house and we decided to take some of our skills that we learned in school. And we wanted to play, I think it was Halo or some video game on their Wi-Fi. And so, figured out in probably about an hour how to break into their Wi-Fi. And from what I can remember, his dad was some lead at a, some security lead at a Silicon Valley firm and some big Silicon Valley company. And he's like, wait a second, you guys broke into my Wi-Fi just so you could play Halo? Like, how did you crack my password? And that kind of, that was probably the first conversation of like, oh, hold on a second, you can actually get paid to do this kind of stuff, to do this kind of work. And so that's kind of where I made the transfer. Is I was very interested in learning more about what he did, and so he was gracious enough to give me a shot and say, hey, noob, looks like you. Looks like you might have some computer chops, so let's put them to the test. And so that's where I got my start.
So you started learning programming or just general computer knowledge even while you were a civil engineering major with your roommate?
Yeah,
or was that like...
It was included in some of the classes because there was a lot of stuff where, if you're dealing with like civil engineering, for somebody who might be listening to podcasts and is not quite aware, is like, well, you build big things. It's like bridges, dams, streets, buildings, like that kind of a thing. And when you're learning like basic engineering concepts, you're dealing with like all your basic shapes. And so when you're doing math on basic shapes, it's pretty easy because, they're basic, they're, flat, they're 90-degree angles. But then anytime you get into more complicated shapes, like if you look at I-beams on buildings or the way water flows, that gets really complicated really quickly. And so a lot of that was kind of like, hey, how can we do a lot of computers are perfect at doing a lot of calculations really, really quickly. And so if I wanted to get my homework done a lot quicker, I would write a quick program to like, go through a bunch of, guess and checks. And so it wasn't like anything crazy. It was, a lot of Googling, a lot of YouTubing to figure out how to get stuff to go. But yeah, it was a part of my curriculum, but also just because it was interesting. And then I figured out in the civil engineering workforce that if you could use programming to do your job, you could knock out 80 hours worth of work in about 5 minutes if you wrote the right program. So there was definitely one of those like, oh, I see the value in this. Oh, sorry, my light turned off. Click it back on. But yeah, so anyways, that's kind of how we got the start.
So that led you to what you do now, which is you're, penetration tester, sometimes also known as a white hat hacker. Are they interchangeable terms? Can you call yourself both, or?
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like once you kind of get to a certain level in like the pen testing space, when you hear somebody say like white hat, black hat, gray hat, all that stuff, it's more. It feels to me like when I hear those terms, it feels like, oh, this is how like this is how like CNN is talking about somebody, or this is how like a major news organization is referring to somebody who does this kind of work. I feel like anybody, I feel like typically it's like information security or like a security person or computer security. I feel like hacker is a term that has a lot of meaning that people apply to it. So I always try and steer away from it. But then somebody would be like, "But wait, that means you're a hacker, right?" And it's like, "Yeah, okay, you got me." Like, yes, I am. So, but yeah, that and the term white hat, black hat, that basically just goes into like white hat is somebody who does it, for good, professionally, not to like do any harm or anything like that. And black hat you can think of as being like, oh, somebody who's going to go ransomware a hospital to get all the bitcoins, and hold them for ransom, kind of a thing.
And that's not your line of work.
That is
You
not my
you're
line of
breaking
work.
into systems to expose vulnerabilities and help people patch and fix.
Yeah.
Can you go into your day to day a little bit and just like break down? I know there is that hacking side of things, but there's also the communication side, right?
Oh yeah. So gosh, so my wife always laughs at me because so she was a couple as well, and she's like, "Oh, all you engineers, you just think that you're going to sit in a cubicle and do equations and do math and do all this stuff, and that your soft skills are never going to get used, or like your writing skills aren't ever going to get used and all that stuff." And I probably spend maybe 40% of my day given on any given week actually doing like computer hacking, programming work, and all that kind of stuff. And then I'd say probably the other 20% of that is actually just on the phone, explaining stuff that I've done to, explaining exploits to clients and explaining, hey, this is how I broke into your company. So always having to be on the phone, always having to try and, explain, using, gosh, all these different analogies and synonyms of like, hey, like this is how this relates to the real world. And then probably the other 40% of that is using technical writing, and writing down and documenting everything that I've done so that the individuals, the clients that read up my report actually understand, hey, this is what Eric did. This is how we can patch it. So yeah, so I mean, if you combine that 20% on the phone, 40% writing, that 60% of my job is actually, communicating with other people that are often technical, super technical end of the spectrum to, like somebody who is, who just has a Mac that they use at home, just both ends of the technical spectrum that I have to work with. So yeah, it's just funny. My wife always makes fun of me because she's like, I bet you had no idea this is what was coming for you.
Well, and can you give an idea of what kinds of clients you typically work on, or what types of
Yeah.
systems?
So obviously I can't name names, but I do everything from very large universities. On East Coast, West Coast, I've broken into a number of hospitals, power plants, software companies, retail, uh, gosh, like you name it. Like I mean, I've done work for the military, done work for pretty much any type of industry that you can think of. I've done some work based upon that in security, and it really makes sense because at the end of the day, like I work for Dell SecureWorks, which is a large company, right? And so we can bring in Fortune 100s, Fortune 500s, just these massive companies, all the way down to maybe not so massive companies, and you know, all things being equal, the clients that we have a lot of the same security problems, right? They have, potentially insecure passwords. They have, different ways that they've exposed themselves. And so big or small, everybody needs that to some degree. And so it's really interesting. It makes things, always interesting to say like, oh, what are you breaking into this week? And it's like, oh, this week I'm breaking into like a fast food, restaurant chain. Or hey, this week I need to go try and fish my way or hack my way into a chain of hospitals. Or hey, I'm calling the help desk of this university to see if they can reset my student ID. And it's like, well, you're not a student. It's like, that doesn't matter. Like, I'm trying to reset it. So all these different types of industries, space included in that. And it's just a wild ride. And the amount of information that I see on a day-to-day basis that I get to learn from, all these industry professionals in their fields, is it's great. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Well, you said working on systems big or small, and it kind of, we were talking the other day about how, I think people think about security and especially something like pen testing as this kind of big corporate, like industry level topic. But a lot of times, smaller companies are the
Yeah.
ones that kind of have the most vulnerable systems and get hurt the most by some of these
Yeah.
types of attacks.
And that's absolutely right. I mean, so like again, a lot of our companies are the large Fortune 500s that you can think of, and those large companies, they have the budget to be able to have a security team. They can have an entire SOC, which is like Security Operations Center. They can have a full team of people looking at logs, looking at firewall logs, and just saying, hey, here's an alert. Hey, here's something that happened. And that's great for large companies, but if you're a smaller company that anywhere from and I say small is a company of like 1,000 people, but if you have anywhere from 1,000 to just, one or two people, those are the companies that they sometimes struggle to basically come up with, security personnel to be able to look at something at a moment's notice, or maybe even have that expertise, right? Because you have some of these large companies, and you might have somebody who's solely focused on like firewall, patching and firewall management, or then you might have somebody who is solely focused on the application and the apps and the backend API. Whereas a small mom and pop shop, they some small company that maybe has 8 employees, the IT guy, if there is an IT guy and that's his full job, he has to stay just as up to date in terms of making sure everything is patched, making sure that he's reading the news for the latest exploits and things that have been happening. All the while answering the phone when somebody's mouse stops working and they just never changed out the batteries. And so really everybody thinks of like, oh, this super large company got hacked. You look at like Experian, you look at SolarWinds, you look at Microsoft, and yeah, I mean those absolutely have a lot of impact. But when it comes to the day to day, the mom and pops, the all the way up to 1,000-person companies, they everybody needs some kind of security in their life, because hackers are typically opportunistic. And so if you have a weak username and password, if your email is exposed on the public internet, odds are, they're just going to fire indiscriminately and hope that, hey, they get lucky. They're not specifically always targeting the large companies out there.
I want to turn it, towards space. I know in DEFCON and I guess it was last year at the online aerospace village, you did like a hack a satellite tutorial
Yeah.
type of thing. And we've been at the Cybersecurity Institute. We've been talking a lot about cybersecurity in space, and we just had the symposium back in 2020. I think it was October as well, or sorry, yeah, it was October. And
Yeah.
yeah. And did you happen to tune into that one online,
Yeah.
or was it?
Yeah. I watched a number of the presentations. They're great.
It was, yeah, it was a week. I think it was 4 days long online. It was really great, and it's really got me interested in this conversation of like, okay, there's like an entire different ecosystem of technology that we're just putting in space, and it probably presents new problems for security. Can you just kind of give an overview of what security in space looks like?
So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to send something to space, you have to have the funding to do that, and it's not at all like starting up oh yeah, I'm just going to buy a computer off Amazon, right? If you're going to send something to space, I forget what the cost is per launching 1 kilogram, but it's in the thousands of dollars, right? So you look at even cube satellites will cost you thousands and thousands of dollars to launch into space, and you have to look at the orbit associated with that, and there's just all this work that goes into just sending something up there. And so when you do that, you want to make sure that all of your software is completely reliable. You want to make sure your operating system, is going to be, rock solid, especially getting hit by cosmic rays and cosmic particles out in space. It's not as easy as calling somebody up and saying like, hey, can you turn off that computer and turn it back on for me? Like in space, it has to be stable. And sometimes there's a trade-off between stability and security, right? You're not going to update your proverbial operating system, a week before launch day, and assume that everything's going to work perfectly. That might be a little terrifying, from that perspective, because everybody knows what happens when you update. Like, hey, that doesn't print like it used to. I just installed an update the other day, and it's like, wow, like what happened to color printing, right? And now imagine if that's a satellite, right, that you launch up into space. And typically the timelines on developing a spacecraft are years and years and years and years. And so you look at like just the past year in terms of like secure, infosec, security related exploits and hacks that have happened between SolarWinds and Microsoft's Exchange. And that's just in the past honestly, that's just in the past couple of months. Now imagine your timeline for building and developing a satellite is years and years and years and years. And if somebody finds an exploit, it's not trivial to go apply a patch or an update because you want to be 100% certain that that's not gonna affect your satellite when it's up there, right? Because you can't reboot it. So yeah, it's a tough nut to crack. The benefit that the satellites do have is that they're far away and in space. But so it's not something that's immediately plugged into the direct internet. But the cheaper and cheaper hardware becomes, and the more ubiquitous other satellites become, I think you're going to start seeing a full ecosystem open up. So yeah, we'll see what happens with it.
As satellites become cheaper to make and as the time to launch kind of decreases, and you just mentioned how it's important that like all of the security work be done early in the process, because it's not as easy as just like doing a typical patch or rebooting a satellite.
Yeah.
So is that a problem where we're going to see like less time to launch, but then also less time to prepare for those types of security measures?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Where you get faster launch times and potentially sending something up. You have the benefit of having potentially sent a number of other objects up into space. But then you have some reality of, hey, if you're doing a quick turnaround to launch, who knows potentially what was missed, what was overlooked. And then also the other piece of that is, how do those satellites communicate with their ground station, with their um, with their terrestrial counterpart, right? Are they relaying through other satellites? What does that look like? Can other satellites pick up those communications? Or what happens if somebody on the ground intercepts those communications? Are they all encrypted? How does that look? What's the purpose of the satellite? There's just so many things that go into it, and it's such a complicated process. And there's so many different industries and so many different just aspects of that all lumped together, that it's kind of an impossibly hard thing. And it's honestly a wonder that there aren't more satellite problems, that there aren't that there just aren't more problems in general. Like, I always think it's a miracle when a computer starts up. Everybody's like, oh man, I can't believe that, like, these computers have so many problems. And I'm like, I just can't believe they work. Like, they're genuinely the most complicated things that humans have ever built, and the fact that like they power on 99% of the time is truly bewildering. And so then slap a rocket onto one of them and launch it up into space, and the fact that it can be bombarded with radiation, again, like, launch times are getting quicker, and payloads are getting smaller, and electronics are getting smaller and more hardened. It's truly a miracle to me that works. But I think no matter what, there's always gonna be unintended consequences, and things potentially baked in that shouldn't be there. Like, and a good example is, you look at solar winds. I know I mentioned a bunch of times, but in my line of work, that's a supply chain vulnerability. So SolarWinds is a company that got hacked, and then it's used by a number of large organizations that it was used basically as a Trojan horse, as a way to get hackers in the door into those large companies. And what's to say that there isn't some supply chain risk, supply chain vulnerability for chip manufacturers, to OS developers, to even somebody introducing malicious code into some open source project, right? There's so many moving pieces that it is impossible to keep track of all of them. So yeah, I don't know. It's a very hard question to solve. I mean, it's a great question to solve. It always means job security, but it's interesting.
There's so much job opportunity in security. Seeing, I mean, we work with the university, and we're always trying to do training and talk about that all the time. But I think the enthusiasm that I see at DEFCON and within communities of hackers, that's kind of what gives me hope in this kind of landscape, where it's like, oh, the problem of security is hard, and it's not necessarily something that's easy to incentivize. When the focus is on building these really, really cool systems. But people like yourself, exist, and they exist in numbers, and like it's super, important that you do. Otherwise, these systems would probably not miraculously work a good bit of the time. Well, one of those, newer technologies, among plenty of others, is, like space-based internet, like Starlink. I mean, that's the big one. And I just kind of wanted to talk about it because it's an interesting, I guess, case study, and in this sort of problem with security, because it's gonna just, first of all, I mean, it's gonna be a lot of satellites.
Yep.
I think I can't remember the actual number, but I think in the next 10 years we're projected to go from, I think it's roughly 2,000 ish satellites in space now to roughly 12,000. Big increase, especially if you include all those ones that are with, space-based internet. But can you talk a little bit about how those systems are gonna, be different and maybe complicate security from a, just a broad standpoint?
Yeah, I mean that could be a full podcast in and of itself. So Starlink is honestly incredible, right? The fact that Elon Musk is launching up, he's making launches of 60 satellites at a time look absolutely routine, to the point where there's going to be thousands of satellites just in low Earth orbit, providing internet to the world. Stuff. This is something that Google couldn't do, Facebook couldn't do, with their like Google Loom project and all that stuff. Yeah, and you're gonna see millions, if not billions, of people added to the global internet that before never had internet. So that part of it's awesome. From a security perspective, I look at it and say, now there are thousands of computers up in space, all talking to one another, and they're all networked together, right? Like what could go wrong? And hopefully they have a really good security team. I'm sure they have thought about that. But there's a lot of entry points. There's a lot of things that could happen there, right? And not to mention too, it's not just, hey, you have a bunch of satellites that are up in space, but any customer of Starlink now has a dish that communicates directly with those satellites and tracks those satellites, right? So it even takes the hard part out of the satellite communication. It takes the hard part out of it for most individuals, right? It has this super complicated phased antenna array that doesn't move a whole lot, but can keep track of a full constellation of satellites. So at what point do you see somebody start to use that and start to probe that network? And I would honestly be surprised if there weren't individuals already probing it, both that work for Starlink, but also people that are potentially beta testers of the Starlink platform. So yeah, I mean, honestly, I'll be really excited to see where things go and to see write-ups, and I'm sure DEFCON talks and all that stuff about what is going to happen. But the other piece of that is that these satellites all talk to one another. And so yeah, it's just going to be wild to see what happens. I think ultimately it's going to be a great thing, but more computers up in space with hackers able to talk to them. It'll be interesting to see how things go.
I just found out there's a Cal Poly team working on satellite encryption for like small sats.
Sure.
And, because encryption, a lot of stuff from satellites right now is actually unencrypted. There's definitely encrypted stuff up there, but encryption's kind of been a hard problem just, for a number of reasons I'm sure you could go into, but I won't ask you to right now. But, I think it's, that's like one layer among probably many of the vulnerabilities that exist in that new context, because, encryption is one layer. It protects against people intercepting your messages and reading it without permission, the right key to unlock it. But then you talked the other day about this sort of cosmic event that could maybe be used as a vulnerability. Like, can you paint
Yeah.
that picture really quick? Because it's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, gosh, the encryption piece of it, right? You have a satellite that costs you money up in space that has to have power and resources, all to do computations and what is put up there to do. And then you're saying, hey, if we're going to transmit information back to the ground, we need a little bit more overhead, or a lot more overhead, depending on the type of encryption that's used, to encrypt the signal, to scramble the signal so that not everybody can read it as it's being back to Earth. And so that's one of those things that is not unreasonable if your data is not supposed to be super secure, to maybe not even encrypt those communications because of the extra overhead and extra processing power that could be spent running a guidance system, or could be spent making sure it doesn't burn up on entry, and doing orbital techniques or whatever, some transfer to keep it up in the air, or up in space, right? Up in orbit. And so yeah, it's just wild. And again, I also talk about like all the cosmic radiation and all that stuff that can happen. There's recently an Ars Technica article that came out about this, and that's where we got this tangent of cosmic particles that would basically there are always cosmic rays, cosmic particles beaming down from Earth, from stars, from from our star, the sun, And if one of those particles hits a chip in the exact right way, it can flip, a transistor on that switch, or it can flip an electron to basically go from a 0 to a 1. And if that happens, there's potential that that data gets, corrupted. And that's why there's tons of error checking on operating systems. But the theory was that essentially, if you bought a whole bunch of domains that were 1 bit off from, like, say, Windows, that if a cosmic particle or cosmic ray were to come in and flip that bit, well, now all of a sudden, instead of it reaching out to Windows.com, it might reach out to, Wandos.com. Not going to go into like bits and all that stuff. That wouldn't technically be the domain, but it would be possible to potentially, with all the, millions and millions, if not billions, of Windows machines out there, and to have a rare event like a cosmic ray, flip some bit in memory or some URL as somebody's going to go view this, that it might be possible to relay an exploit with a domain that would only be, able to be accessed if the right bit was flipped. And it's a crazy percentage when you start dealing with math at that scale of, like, oh, billions of computers, and there's a 1 in a million chance that this happens. Well, if you have a billion computers and there's a once in a million chance that it happens daily, that's what, 1,000 events that could potentially trigger, right? So math at those scales goes wonky, and it becomes one of those things, like, while you're hanging out talking with friends, of like, oh, wouldn't it be crazy if hold on a second, that actually might be possible, to hold on a second, now I need to write a thesis about this, to hold on a second, now it's getting picked up by Ars Technica, and right, like, I just thought that was a really interesting article to read, especially given the context of things that we're seeing, and especially more and more satellites being thrown up into space, to just know that that is just a sliver of the difficulties that satellite manufacturers, and computer scientists and engineers and electrical engineers all have to put up with. Anyways, I just think it's fascinating and wild that that's even something that can happen.
Yeah, well, in the way of, how security engineers are often just focusing on the things that they know they can control, when you have, and there's so much uncertainty with that to start off with, and then you start getting into these, like, environmental factors that you can't control. Absolutely, you can't control them. So that's
be wild.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely, you'll have to send that article. We'll want to include it in the notes if we can. And so, just kind of moving as we wrap up here, we don't really have that much time left. From your background and your experience as a penetration tester, can you just kind of, like, what's one thing you would improve?
Yeah, I think it would be to put obviously this is like, what would you say to a plumber to recommend, for your household? It's like, oh, well, have preventative, plumbing maintenance done once a year, right? So you ask a hacker, hey, what would you do to improve this? I'm going to say, throw a hacker on your team, right? Like, from the onset of development, throw a hacker on your team to point out, potential avenues, like maybe not even an exploit, just ooh, man, somebody could do this nasty thing that potentially you didn't think about. But throw somebody on your team that has the mindset of, how would I break this? Or how would I exploit this from the onset? And I think that would go a long way for all things. It doesn't have to be just for satellites. It could be for absolutely all pieces of software and computer technology, right?
Hey, I hope you like hearing what Eric had to say about ethical hacking and satellite security. I have to say that I'm really excited to see what new capabilities that space technology will bring us in the next 10 to 15 years. But I'm also worried that as with any new technology, we might be in for some challenges as the digital attack surface in space expands. Now, if you enjoyed that interview with Eric, you can learn more about him in the show notes, where I've linked some more information about Eric and all the cool stuff that he talked about. We're going to be talking a lot more about the space sector and rapid changes happening in satellite networks in future episodes. So don't miss another chance to spend another coffee or lunch break right here at the Cyber Diner. Thanks again for stopping by, and I'll see you next time. This podcast is presented by Cal Poly California Cybersecurity Institute, where we're training the next generation of cyber experts to navigate today's complex threat landscape. To learn more about training and research programs, visit cci.calpoly.edu. Special thanks to the team of Cal Poly staff and students that helped put this podcast together, including CCI Program Manager Martin Minnick and Cal Poly students and alumni, including Grace Pickering, Lauren Boyer, Nathan Danielson, and Jared Contreras. A special thanks to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for support in the planning and production of this episode. This episode is made possible in part by the Department of Defense and California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. The content of this podcast reflects the views of the California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo, California Cybersecurity Institute, and does not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Defense, Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation, or the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research.